Hello, everyone. My name is Marius Moscovici. I am the founder. Oh, let me put my camera on. Sorry about that. Hello, everyone. My name is Marius Moscovici, and I am the founder and CEO of Metric Insights. And today I am delighted to be joined by Bob Seiner. Bob is the president and principal of Kick Consulting, and he is also the founder of TDAN, which has been a great resource for metadata, for governance, for really all things data related for a really long time. I think Bob's been running it for 25 years. He is also an adjunct instructor at the Carnegie Mellon University with a program that teaches senior folks around governance and data management, and has just been spent a lot of his career educating people around governance, around good data management practices, around really many aspects of BI. And so I'm really excited to have Bob coming here today and share and the non-invasive approach around BI governance. Bob is actually written a book called Non-Invasive Data Governance. It is, I think, the best-selling book in the data governance space. And so today he's going to share some ideas as they relate to BI governance from that book. So thank you, Bob, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay. So before we get into Bob's presentation, I'm going to set the stage a little bit by giving you a little bit of sense of what BI governance is, and then we'll jump in and let Bob share his thoughts. So to level set, people think a lot about data governance these days and know what data governance is, but oftentimes, BI governance is a little bit less discussed. So let's kind of define it a little bit. If we think of BI governance as the combination of the governance of your data and your governance around your analytics, your reports, your dashboards, the assets that are created by your data science team, Excel spreadsheets that are being shared by the organization, everything people are using to make decisions. And so, if you think about it, combining these two together makes a lot of sense, because if all you're doing is governing your data, you're solving only part of the problem. Imagine for a moment that you wanted to test, make sure that you have high quality water coming into your house and your home, right? You're concerned about your water quality, not your data quality. So in that scenario, you're not going to be satisfied just to know that the municipality is producing good water and it's coming out of a clean well and it's being treated properly. What you want to know is that it makes it all the way into your faucet cleanly, that it's, that there's not any issues with your pipes, no contaminants there. Maybe you have a water filter that's pulling the water in. Unless you know that it's clean coming out of your tap, you don't really know that you've satisfied the idea of getting quality all the way through. So it's the same idea with data. Your data is going from its source and it's getting transformed, it's getting loaded into your data warehouse. And of course, you want to be able to govern that process and make sure that that's well understood, and that's very important. But it's insufficient because all that data is consumed through some analytic, a dashboard, a report, something that somebody's created. And just the simple fact of adding a filter can change all that of the data that's being consumed. And so you want that governance, the good things that are there in your governance environment, to flow all the way through into your BI tools. And that's why BI governance is so important. So how do you know if your BI governance is present in your organization? Well, it's easy to be able to see if there's a lack of governance. That's much more obvious. So I thought, one simple way to present this is kind of give you a set of tests that you can run. If you look in your organization and you see that there's maybe a lack of discoverable content, for example, people are going in and they're, creating duplicative content because they don't realize that something already exists. Maybe 3 or 4 versions of the same dashboard, some of which are obsolete, some of which are current. So those kinds of situations, then there's the lack of proper governance. If your environment looks like a jungle instead of a well-maintained garden, right? So if there's lots of clutter there, lots of content that maybe people don't run into, but is not useful to them on their way to try to discover the 1 or 2 or 3 pieces of content that they need. that's a sign that governance is really not present to the extent that it needs to be. If there's general lack of trust in data and reporting, so in the sense of both I as an end consumer of information, if I'm not able to trust that the data is good in this report, also that I'm able to trust that I interpret it correctly, that I understand that when I'm looking at sales, this is what sales means here, and then I'm looking at the right report to measure sales in the way that I need it to be able to make my decision. So all of that goes into trust, and if you don't have that whole chain of lineage and information that tells the user that this is how I should interpret this information, then that is a big challenge to governance. And then symptomatically, that these things all tend to lead to low utilization and BI tool licenses. So finding that people are not going in very often to look at analytics that have been built and are not underutilizing the significant investment that you've made in BI. And then as a result, the BI team, the analysts are just fighting fires. They're responding constantly to inquiries from users for things that they could self-service on their own. So the degree of self-service isn't happening to the extent that it should be. So if any of these things are happening within an environment, then there's some challenges with BI governance that need to be addressed. So with that said, let's talk a moment about data governance, right? And so what does data governance usually look like in an enterprise? And there are oftentimes tools that people use for data governance, and you might see an architecture that looks like this. Right? So I might have data coming from different sources. There might be ETL tools that transforms that data and moves it around, puts it into a data warehouse. And then oftentimes you might have a data governance or data catalog tool that you've implemented. And this could be something like a Calibra or an Elation. It could be something you've built on your own. It could be one of the open source technologies that came out of many different organizations, or it could be a cloud-based solution. All of the major cloud providers have governance tools. And these tools typically do the following things. They bring in metadata from the ETL tools and the data sources so that you know what's going on with your data, you know how does the data end up in your data warehouse, what are the transformation rules that are used to do that. All of that comes in. You can track, also bring in information for some of these technologies from your BI tools. You're going to be bringing in a list of objects from Tableau, maybe from MicroStrategy, the variety of different tools that the data catalog may be connecting to. Bring it all in one place and then capture a whole layer of metadata around that. So you're going to be doing things like saying, what data quality issues do I have, and capturing those and cataloging those, certifying versus various data sets and saying this is the table you should go to be able to find retail sales. This is the trusted area. Capturing usage stats from that will help you then determine how to consume the content. Doing things around data classification, so tagging these data sets and saying, oh, this contains PII data here, this column has highly sensitive information, things of that nature. Visualizing that lineage information and creating business glossaries. So things like what are the business terms? How do you define churn? How do you define sales? What are the things that are the key definitions in the business? And managing these data assets through a whole life cycle. Right? So this is all very powerful and very useful, but the audience for this content tends to be really focused on the analyst. Right? If I'm a data scientist or an analyst that's living in the data governance tool, then I can benefit from all this information. But if I am one of the consumers there on the right-hand side of the slide, if I'm the BI user, BI consumer, somebody who just uses the dashboard, all of this information is sort of locked away where I can't reach it, right? I don't, with the exception of maybe a few scenarios where maybe I can propagate certification information from a Calibra or an Elation into a Tableau automatically. With those few exceptions, I'm not really able to benefit from all of the wealth of information that I've captured in my governance tool. And this is a fundamental flaw, fundamental limitation in the current data governance architectures organizations have. So one solution for that is that you can use the BI portal as a governance platform. And in this environment, you're basically been saying, okay, let's marry the governance information we just talked about from the data governance perspective with engagement information that you're capturing from your, and that you're, excuse me, with engagement enablement that is possible through your portal. So as an example, your portal enables search. And so you can enable search such that when I'm doing a search, I'm going to be able to find all of the tagging and metadata associated with the content that's there. Maybe I can search across not just my BI content, but I can search across all the content that's available from a table and data perspective as well, right? Access requests, I'll be able to request information for content that I have out there. There may be personalization around announcements and things around activity that's happening from a data perspective when there's an issue with data. Alerting, right, is a key thing. So I've got data quality issues. Well, I want to be able to discover those data quality issues, not only flag them, but be able to surface those to users so that they can understand what they are and then take proactive action accordingly in the way that they use the data. And then things such as contextual lineage and data classification, all those things, be able to see that information together with the content that I'm viewing as an end user. So the idea is, combine it all together so that, again, all that wealth of information that's there from a governance perspective isn't just locked away in a vault somewhere, but it's there for users to be able to engage with when they're consuming the content as BI consumers. Now, of course, as an organization, you may already have an investment that you've made, and you might be already using a data catalog tool. Maybe you've bought a Calibra relation, or you've invested in your own technology that you've deployed. So in those scenarios, then what you really want is to be able to not reinvent the wheel. You don't want to rebuild all of this governance metadata in a catalog, right? But what you want to do in your BI catalogs, you want to be able to just simply pull that data in from the data catalog so that those things that the analysts are comfortable maintaining in their data catalog as their system of record can live there, but then it can automatically flow in to your BI portal and be used to be able to then be consumed by your end users. So now your end users can access the information that is being maintained both in some cases being maintained in the portal, but in other cases it's flowing in from your data catalog. And you can have a sort of a best of both worlds, sort of hybrid type of configuration. So this is kind of just gives you, again, just our view of the architecture, how BI portals work together with catalogs and provide solution. And with that said, I'm going to transition to Bob, where he can talk to you about really what non-invasive data governance is about and how it applies to BI governance.
Well, thank you very much, Marius. Thank you very much, Metric Insights, for having me on this webinar. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you. I just want to kind of go back to some of the things that Marius talked about at the beginning of the webinar. And he talked about BI governance, and then he had data governance and analytics governance. And I actually think there are several steps, several leaps that we need to take to go from data governance to BI governance. And I want to share a little bit of my thoughts with you on that subject. When I start by defining data governance, and I have a very strongly worded definition for data governance, and that is that data governance itself is the execution and enforcement of authority over the management of data and all the data related assets, including the stewards, including the glossary and the dictionary and everything that's going to make the data in the BI tool more valuable to you. But I word it very strongly because no matter what approach you take, whether you take a non-invasive approach, which kind of views it as you're already governing data, but you're doing it very informally. So let's apply some formality to it and go from being less formally governed to being more formally governed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between what governed and ungoverned looks like in a minute here. But start with a definition of data governance. And then I talk a lot about different labels that are applied to data governance. So we've heard about master data governance. We've heard of big data governance, small data governance, AI governance, BI data governance. And when people start to talk about things in terms of BI data governance, that becomes a label that is now added to data governance. And if you see how the definition has actually changed, when I go from that first block on the left to the one in the middle, it's the execution and enforcement of the management of BI data. So now we're focusing specifically on BI data. Just like organizations that have master data governance or big data governance, it sounds to me, at least, as though they're focusing on that which they're labeling at the beginning. So yeah, we can go from data governance, but what's the difference between BI governance and master data governance? Well, it's really the data that you are governing. So it hasn't really changed all that much. It's just data governance being applied to BI data. But now we've been using the term BI governance, and actually BI governance is a different monster, should I say, completely from BI data governance. In the fact, it may not be completely different, but it's different because we're talking about now executing and enforcing authority over the BI landscape. All of the things that Marius just talked about that are really important aspects to BI portals. That needs to be governed, that needs to be managed. I am known to say quite a bit that the data will not govern itself. Well, the BI environment will not govern itself. So we go from data governance to the data governance for BI data, and then we take the step into BI governance. And now we're talking about more than just the data. We're talking about the environment, we're talking about the tool, and then some of the capabilities and things that I'm going to talk about next. So let's go to the next slide. And so I mentioned before, first of all, I mentioned a little bit about non-invasive data governance, and the idea of being non-invasive is to look to where governance already exists in your organization and leverage that before you start taking the command and control iron fist, thou shalt do this, we're going to change your job. No, you know what? There's governance already taking place in the organization. And you know what, I would wager that in your BI environment, there's already governance taking place of things in the BI environment. However, they may not be as formal as they could be. And so when we talk about applying non-invasive or the non-invasive approach to BI governance, it's to look to see those things that are already taking place that could be improved and making certain that we have a resolute effort that focuses on improving those things. So we want to talk about what does governed BI look like versus ungoverned BI. I think I have that, I should say ungoverned BI on the right-hand side. So I pardon that. But so we look at governed BI where there is formal governance. There is the execution and the enforcement of authority over the management of data. There is formal accountability for the data. People that define data, produce data, use data as part of their job, and they're being held formally accountable for how they use it. Those people are data stewards. It's not really an opportunity to opt in or opt out of being a steward. If you are being held formally accountable for those things that you do with data or those things that you do in your BI environment, then that's formal accountability. And I can't tell you the number of organizations that oftentimes talk about the lack of accountability within the organization. You may want to look at that and see how much accountability is there truly and formalize it rather than handing it to people as something that's brand new to them. And under governed BI, there's also formal communications and messaging. Those are really important. We are going to make certain these things aren't going to happen on their own. We need to have people that have the responsibility for formal communications and messaging. If your tool can do that, that's an added bonus for certain. So on the right side, again, consider that it says ungoverned BI. It's a situation where you don't have any formal governance, where there is no execution and enforcement and no authority and no formal accountability for the management of the aspects of the BI environment. And also in an ungoverned BI environment, there's going to be a lack of that formal communications and a lack of that formal messaging. So first thing to think about, at least from this slide, is that non-invasive is an alternative approach to data governance. It can also be applied to BI governance in the fact that if you've got a BI environment, you're applying a BI tool, a BI portal to that environment, you wouldn't have gotten to the point where you are if there was a complete lack of governance. So to take a non-invasive approach means to look at those things that are working properly, even though it may not necessarily be governed yet, and apply that formal governance and that formal accountability to it. So there's a clear distinction between governed BI and in this situation where it should say ungoverned BI. But I think you catch the drift. All right, let's go on to the next slide. All right, so why do I even use the word non-invasive to describe the approach to data governance? Well, because, and I had a client tell me this the other day, that if I'd called it invasive data governance, they probably never would have read my book. But non-invasive is, the idea is to look to see what already exists in the organization and to leverage that and to improve on the messaging to the organization. One question that I get asked a lot is, why is governance in general difficult to accomplish? And the truth is that people within all of your organizations are very busy. They're busy. They're not just busy 100% of the time. They're busy 120, 150% of the time. And if we go to them and we assign them new roles and responsibilities, immediately it's going to feel like that's over and above the work that they're doing now, which, like I said before, it could be 150% of their time. So people are very busy. And we want to take an approach to governing BI, to governing data, that is going to be less threatening to them, less invasive to what they are doing. The subtitle of my book is The Path of Least Resistance and Greatest Success. We need to get the messaging right so that people understand this is, it does sound scary. The term governance, like government, sounds scary. We want, these are all reasons why governance is difficult to accomplish. It's difficult to be able to say that by putting formal governance in place, this is our return on investment. I always say, look at your BI environment, look at the return you're getting from what you are investing in your BI tools and in improving your BI data, and think you're not going to be able to leverage that investment unless the data is, you're confident about the data, the quality of the data, the trust that people have in that data. So governance is difficult. Non-invasive, it's not a do nothing approach, it's actually a do everything approach, because we're going to look to see what already exists in our environment and take advantage of that and leverage those types of things. So I would suggest that you would want to consider being non-invasive and applying BI governance the same way. Instead of assigning people into roles, recognize them into roles. Look to see what people are presently doing, even in your BI environment, and then formalize accountability rather than giving things to people that are immediately may feel as though it's over and above what they presently have to do. And in non-invasive approach, and I know there's lots of processes that are associated with governing the BI environment, we're going to apply governance to the process. We're not going to change we will make certain that the right people get involved at the right time to do the right things throughout that process. That's what governance is about. Taking a non-invasive approach is, a lot of these people are already doing this stuff already. Let's leverage them. Let's formalize them. Formalize it. Let's, as the governance practitioners in the organization, help them to do it more efficiently and help them to do it more effectively. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so there were a couple of things that Marius talked about earlier in the slide presentation or in the webinar that I want to speak to. And one of them is just about some of the capabilities that are provided in good BI portal tools. And the fact is that none of these things, quality, certification, the presentation of usage stats, and the things that Marius talked about, those aren't going to happen on their own. It requires that somebody has the formal accountability for addressing those things. So let's talk about quality for a minute. And many organizations want to focus their governance programs on quality. And they think that, okay, we can buy a tool and all of a sudden it's going to clean up the environment. It doesn't happen. It requires people. It requires process. A lot of times it requires technology as well. So we need to govern not only the quality of the data, but we need to govern the quality of the metadata that we are going to be able to share through a portal tool like the one that we're talking about in this webinar here. Certification, the same thing. It's not going to happen on its own. In order to do certification, you need to define standards. And in order to be able to say this is certified or this is correct or isn't correct, you need to understand what correct means. So certification involves the definition of standards. The definition of standards requires that people have accountability for doing that. Non-invasive, we're going to look for the people that have the most knowledge to help us to define the data, define the quality standards, define the certification process, because it's not as easy as just saying, okay, you're certified, you're not certified. There has to be standards that need to be governed in order to get you there. We talked about the usage stats and being able to tell where using a BI portal tool is going to help you in your environment. It takes the collection of that information. It takes the sharing of that information. It takes using that information to demonstrate success in what you're doing. So usage stats are a really important component of a BI portal tool, of a catalog tool. You want to know how people are using this and what value they're getting out of it. I could go on and on. I could go through the rest of these. I'll go through them real quickly, but data classification, there are many organizations that are focusing their governance initiatives, their data governance initiatives on data classification, the protection of sensitive data, making certain that the handling rules are being defined. Again, that doesn't happen on its own. You might have an information security group that's already done this. Well, this is a great tool to be able to share that information and let people know that the data that they're accessing is classified a certain way. And that classification is going to dictate down to them how they need to handle the data. Do they need to encrypt the data before they send it? Do they need to clean their desks off at the end of the day and not leave any of this information sitting out there? There's handling rules associated with each of the classifications. People can't be expected to follow the rules, the handling rules, unless they know how that data is classified. Lineage, people want to know where the data comes from. And it's important to deliver that, especially in a BI environment where it could come from a multitude of places. Having a glossary, kind of building your organization towards a common business language. Again, that doesn't happen on its own. That really requires a level of governance in order to do that. And many organizations will start their data governance initiatives focusing on BI, but building a business glossary, common business language that we as an organization want to use moving forward. I would add to that potentially a data dictionary. People want to know the definition of the data that's in their BI environment. They need to know where it came from. They need to know how it's classified. It helps us as administrators to know how it's being used. All of these things tie together. And then Marius talked about the life cycle management. Well, that is governance in a nutshell. From the time that we define the data to the time that we retire the data, every step in between, even defining the requirements for what data we need, that's all included in the life cycle. And to have a tool that you can use to help you to manage through the life cycle is extremely important to, I'd say, every organization that is doing BI as a practice within their organization. All right, next slide. And then also Marius talked about these capabilities that are really important in order to engage people within the organization and get the stewards of the organization to be able to trust the data and use the data. Search, access request, personalization, these things are all extremely important in organizations. And I really like the way that Metric Insights has summarized these 7 points, because they are some of the most important functionality that you can find within a BI portal tool, within a data catalog tool. Number one is opening up the tool like a marketplace. People are very used to doing searches on Google and through whatever search engines you use in your environment. We want to be able to provide that same type of environment to people regarding the BI data. So search is incredibly important. So functionality that we need in order to govern, BI activities and the outcomes, search is certainly rates right up there at the top of the list as being something that's important. And then there's, who gets access to the data? Should they get access to the data? Is there a process for them to follow to request access to data? Are we following certain rules as to who should have the ability to access the data? These are all important functions that can take place through a BI portal, give people the ability to request access to certain data, or even let them know that the data exists so that they can go through the proper channels to request that information. Personalization. I mean, people want to see things that make sense to them. And then so if a tool has the capability to personalize it to the person that is viewing it, it's going to help them to find the things that they need, bookmark the things that they need so that they can really take advantage of what the tool has to offer. Collaboration is important because we want it to create community around the data in the organization. We want to create community around the business intelligence in the organization, and not just the data, but everything that has to do with the whole BI environment. It has to be a collaborative effort between those people that really are stakeholders and the people that understand what it's going to take to be successful at doing these things. Alerting people when some data falls out of range, or when there's a quality issue, or there's a task that they need to address. That is extremely important functionality within a tool like this. Distribution of data, helping people to access that data no matter where they are, on what device within the organization. These are all, I mean, I really honestly believe that these 7 listed right here are extremely important when it comes to the governing of the BI data and the governing of the BI environment in the organization. So I hope that I helped a little bit in explaining how you get from data governance to BI governance, and the fact that there's BI data governance right in between those two. I hope that was helpful to you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Marius.
Thank you, Bob. And by the way, I neglected to mention at the beginning that Bob has been kind enough to really take a lot of these ideas and pull them together into a white paper. And we'll be making that available to you after the presentation. So I know there's a lot of information that came at you in this presentation. Don't feel like you've got to take crazy notes on everything, because you'll be able to have access to his thoughts to be able to socialize them more broadly.
Thanks.
So. With that, let me give you a little bit of a view into just some, so I'll take this kind of into a application or example perspective, where I'm going to just give you some examples of this in action. And then, after that, then we'll kind of open it up to questions. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A section, and Bob and I will take a look at that at the end, and we'll address all your questions. So first thing, from a governance perspective, it's important to understand is when you're attempting this, no matter what tool you're using, you should be thinking about first putting everything in a single place. So getting all of your assets into a single portal. Because fundamentally, if your users have to go to 5 or 6 or 7 different places to get their information, if they're going to Tableau server to get their Tableau content, and they're going to MicroStrategy to get MicroStrategy content, and they're going to SharePoint for their published good Excel and PDF documents, and so on and so forth, then it's, by definition, it's very difficult to establish some kind of cohesive governance around that process, right? Because each of these tools has their own platform with their own limited subset of capabilities. So you want to pull it into one single umbrella, one single portal, where everything is searchable, where that search can be, as Bob said, kind of enriched with the metadata that you've brought in, so that you've got this governed search, and that you can enforce sort of consistent, coherent governance practices across all the assets, irrespective of what is the source of those assets. So that's sort of step one. Make sure you're bringing it all together. Next, you want to make sure that all of that governance information that we talked about, that Bob mentioned, all those different items, that those things are available and accessible to the consumer at the point of access, right? So as a user, if I'm looking at this Tableau dashboard, I want to be able to, when I'm going to consume that dashboard, right at that, not have to go to some other tool, some data catalog tool somewhere else I have to remember to find. Not to have to do that, but instead, right at the point where I'm going to consume the information, be able to see things like, who's the owner of this? Who's the data steward, the technical owner? What are the tags associated with this? Maybe some enterprise KPIs that are there. You can see in this example, I should be able to click on one of those enterprise KPI tags and see what is the definition of that tag, who's the owner of that tag, what is the other content that's available that is also related to that particular enterprise KPI. So if I'm looking at a dashboard and this is really interesting, very useful, maybe it's measuring sales. Well, what are all the other things that are measuring sales that I should be looking at that may be related to this? So be able to find that whole universe of content easily is very important. And then additionally, kind of you see in this example, if you go down to the bottom where it says data sensitivity, important to be able to understand, have all of those data classification details that bubble up all the way to the visualization. So I can look at this. I know that, hey, this is only for internal use, and it does not contain PII data, right? So, and if it did, there'd be some governance rules around that. So all of that visibility and transparency needs to be brought up to the tool when I'm consuming the BI content itself. Lineage is obviously very important, and Bob touched on this. Obviously, it's a big topic in all data catalogs. You're bringing in information about where the data comes from. Well, at the point of consumption, I also want to know lineage information. I want to know, is this coming from my data warehouse? Is it coming directly, or is it coming from someplace else? For this particular piece of content, maybe I'm getting an email. What is the distribution I'm getting? What are all the pieces of content that are part of that, and where's that content coming from? So this lineage is important, but obviously from the analyst, trying to understand, is this the report that I want? Can I repurpose this, or do I need to build something new? That's obviously important in that scenario, but it's also important to that casual user of information where they just want to understand, where the heck is this coming from? So having that present is key. And then process. So I think, Bob made a great point that there is process to publishing content. In his non-invasive approach, you really want to leverage whatever's already in place and build on top of it, not reinventing the wheel there. But you always want to make sure that you have the scaffolding in place to do that. So think about it as you deploy your solutions in this area. Think about how can you develop a process by things move through distinct stages. You have an analytic, it's going to maybe initially get synchronized into your portal to be pending for review, and then somebody has to review it and say, well, now it's going to have documentation added to it, tags. Maybe there are different people in the organization that are responsible for each part of that process. So you want to have a mechanism in place whereby content can be, in an auditable way, moved through the different stages. Whether that's a simple stage where it's just the developer saying, I'm ready to publish this piece of content, or if that content is very sensitive in nature, a high level of distribution, and requires many steps and many hands involved, you want to be able to handle all those different kinds of content through some kind of a publishing process where it's transparent and where all those pieces of critical metadata are added to that content. And so that's very important. And looking at the engagement and the usage aspect, it's very important to measure that and iterate. So if I've put in all this effort to create this governed space, this portal where I'm going to be accessing this content, I've gone through the effort to bring lineage information in, to certify content, to identify, tag it with associate enterprise KPIs and give it context. Well, now I really want to know, is that generating an ROI? And even before you talk about ROI from a financial perspective, one way to measure it, it's to say, well, am I getting eyeballs on it? Are people really using and engaging with this content? And is that engagement consistent? So being able to really measure that engagement, both from a perspective of saying, what's increasing or decreasing in popularity in my content universe, be able to identify what's unused, and then track even over time how that engagement is changing is very important. So if I publish a piece of content, I get a flurry of activity, lots of users are coming in and using it, but then over time, I find that 30, 60, 90 days out, people are not coming back to it. Well, that's a warning sign. That's telling me that, well, I've created something that was maybe interesting to people to check out initially, but it didn't really generate sustained value. And in that situation, I maybe need to think about maybe how that content is organized, maybe restructuring it, maybe it has to be promoted to a different audience, various tools that can be used in the toolkit to do that. But the point is, if you're not measuring and you're not reacting based on those measurements, you really don't have a governed environment, and you're not able to then continuously build more and more value out of it. So having effective measurement, absolutely key. And then you want to measure not only the usage of that content, but to the extent to which the process that you've put in place, perhaps that non-invasive governance approach that you've laid out, to the extent that that's being followed. So, for example, you might say, well, content should be certified, and here's a process for certifying content. Well, how much of the content that's being consumed is really certified, and who's doing that certification? So being able to measure that then identifies those people that are really taking up the mantle of governance, and those places where that's not really happening, And then that allows you to educate those teams. You can use these kind of measurements as a gamification exercise to say, hey, let's have a contest, get all of your content certified, who has which group or which individuals have the highest level of content certification. It can be a fun thing. It doesn't have to be like it can be a carrot rather than a stick, right? But the point being that you need to be measuring it and socializing broadly the metrics you have around governance so that you can determine, is your governance program actually working? So with that, let's pause now, Bob, and let's go back on video and let's see what questions we have from the Q&A section and see what we have. So let me start from the list here that we have. How does BI governance in self-serve environments, particularly in the perspective of a data mesh or data fabric, work? So BI governance in a scenario where you have, I guess, self-serve and you've got a data mesh. Bob, do you have any thoughts on that? I can address it as well.
Oh, I am certainly not that knowledgeable about data meshes and data fabrics. I mean, I hear the term being used. It was used by a client in a meeting today. But BI governance, the result of the impact of governing the BI environment is what leads to the capability of being able to do self-service. I mean, if you don't have a governed BI environment, you don't provide the metadata. I love the way that you laid out the stuff that you just talked about. I thought that really makes a lot of sense because you want to have that information. And if you're going to have a self-service environment, it's not necessarily, think about it in terms of like an iceberg. You only see the top 10% of an iceberg. You don't see what went on behind the scenes to get the data the way that it is, to get the metadata the way that it is, to be able to provide self-service. Not knowing how to really bring the mesh and the fabric, because I try not to speak to things that I'm not that familiar with. So that's what I would say about BI governance and its relationship to self-service BI.
So I would agree with that. I would add a few things that just from what we've seen kind of in our space that typically in these kind of very self-service environments, kind of maybe mesh-like environments where there's lots of different data sources, lots of different BI tools, everybody's maybe different BI teams are creating this content and together creating a cohesive sort of mesh of content. That in those environments, the key piece is to distribute data governance responsibilities out into the field. So it's not a centralized, I have a governance team and this governance team owns everything and has to go through the process. Those environments, you really say, well, you've got a self-service environment, here's some standards. So the governance team might set some standards and guidelines for how things should be adhered to. But then it's the responsibility of each of these sort of nodes, of each of these groups that is creating the self-service content to then comply with that and adhere to that. And so you want to think about the tools and the process aspect and make sure that those fit with organizationally with the people that are going to be using it, that you have buy-in from those members of the organization, and that you have measurements again of compliance around that, so that as if you're part of that centralized team, you just come back to them and say, hey, you're doing a great job, or we've noticed that your team is in this particular area, there's not maybe as much certified content as not, is there anything we can help with? Again, it has to be a non-invasive approach. It shouldn't be, you can't hit people over the head with this kind of stuff, but you can definitely use a number of techniques to basically generate more governance and have it be distributed throughout the organization with the right.
And if you can demonstrate value in these things, and you can convince the people that are even actually accessing the data through the self-service, they can help to augment the content, what was helpful to them. They can note those types of things. So that environment becomes really important. So I like everything that you just said. I think we agree quite a bit.
Okay. Bob, do you have any thoughts on this question? This is an interesting one. I know you, with your experience at TDAN, you have a unique perspective on this. Are there different industry standard frameworks in relation to data governance and BI governance? How can I ensure alignment?
Okay, so there are frameworks. There's a framework that I used when I was getting started in the data management industry was the Zachman Framework. If you're familiar with John Zachman, the enterprise architecture framework, where he looks at the who's, what's, why's, when's, where's, and how's of the organization from a bunch of different perspectives. So the Zachman framework became quite well known. I didn't want to call mine the Seiner framework because it was really playing a lot off of what John had put together. But I do take a similar approach to the framework. So I think that there are core components of governance that have to be addressed in your framework, no matter what framework you select. Those are data, roles, processes, communications, metrics, and tools. And we need to understand those things from different perspectives in the organization. So I think that having a framework itself is really important. Now, is there a role? Can you add BI into the governance framework? I have not yet, should say yet, because it could happen very soon. Tried to incorporate BI into that framework for how you view data across the organization. Certainly, BI tools would fit under the tools piece, the tools component of that framework. And maybe what we can do is I wrote a quick white paper that covers the framework. If we want to attach that to any follow-up email, that would be great. But I would try to incorporate BI into another framework. There are probably, you could do a search on data governance frameworks and find as many as your search engine results will allow. But I mean, there are some that are better structured to help you to apply them than others. And so that's my thoughts about framework and BI governance.
Thank you, Bob. So here's another one. I think that is maybe more specific is how to govern data from being downloaded into local copies through BI tools. Can we have controls around that? It might contain PII, NPI data. I can sort of speak to that just from a practical perspective that, one of the things that we've had, in our product that we've had requests from customers and we've implemented as features is the ability to say, can I tag based on metadata? I can then control how people can access the content in the portal. So, for example, you can say anything that's tagged with PII in the portal now will not allow the user to print or download that information. So that's kind of a typical way in which
those are rules, right? You define rules, and if we can remember back to the slide that we don't have to show it, but go back to my definition of governance, which is the execution and enforcement of authority. It doesn't matter if you take a non-invasive or an iron fist command and control approach. We need to execute and enforce authority. What can prevent people from downloading things like that is if you lock the data to the point where they can't do that and give them reasons why you can't do that. It is a rule like the ones you were just talking about. Who can see what, who can share what, how can we share it, and all of those types of things. So that's the other thing. You go from an ungoverned environment where anybody can download anything at any time, even if it has PII data in it or PHI or intellectual property or whatever it is you're trying to protect. You need to make certain that they can't do that anymore. I mean, just because it's always been that way. And you know what, when you shut it off and when people scream because they don't have access to do these things that they used to be able to do, have them take it up with somebody else, because you're only following the rules and the guidelines that are in most cases being handed to you. They're not ones that you're coming up on on your own. And the government is certainly not coming to you and saying, follow these rules if you want. They're saying you have to. So govern your environment, prevent people from downloading things that they shouldn't be able to go create the nth copy of it.
Thanks, Bob. So here's another good question is, how do very large organizations with compliance overlays and legacy systems and a mediocre grasp between structured and unstructured data begin to think in terms of BI governance, as opposed to simply organizing data as an asset better? Your frameworks here are fine, but they don't suggest what the first 3 steps should be look like. So Bob, what do you think, what would you recommend sort of the first 3 steps and to address this question in very large organizations?
Can you start the question again? So just start at the very beginning of the question.
Yeah. How do very large organizations,
Very large
compliance overlays and legacy systems and a mediocre grasp between structured and unstructured data begin to think in terms of BI governance as opposed to simply organizing data as an asset?
Well, and so all of those things that you just mentioned, they are governance. They are not necessarily data governance. They're not doing the same things that data governance do. So when you have a complex regulatory environment in a large company and the regulations are different from different parts of the world, different regions, you need to be able to govern that, right? You need to, so what I would do is the first thing that I would do, step number 1 is let's recognize where there is governance already taking place in the organization. And then acknowledge that, and like I said, it might not be data governance, and then acknowledge these people to be partners to your focused data governance or BI governance effort. Because you're not here to tell them what to do, and they don't really want to have to tell you what to do. It really needs to be a partnership between you. So that's where I would start, especially in large organizations. Look for the pockets of governance that are taking place. Look for what other types of governing activities are taking place and leverage those, and then talk about the importance of governing the BI environment and the data in the BI environment. Does that help?
I think that's a great answer. The only thing I can think to add to that is one thing that I've seen is that with a number of our customers, we have a few customers that are sort of in the tens, with quite a few customers with tens of thousands of users, and so large organizations. And one of the things I've noticed there is that it is possible to use sort of the BI portal as a forcing function to begin to establish more coherent governance, because if you standardize on the idea to say, well, everything has to be published through the portal, this is where we're going to consume things, then you can create a center of excellence around that team and establish some just baseline governance criteria to say, in order for content to be onboarded, here are the things that it needs to have from a compliance perspective. We need to tag with metadata, we need to identify whether it needs to have PII, it needs to have a following description, and so on and so forth. And then the process of onboarding the content then by its nature then ends up establishing governance. So it requires all the things that Bob said. You have to agree on process, you have to get stakeholders together. It's by no means a trivial undertaking, but you can use the idea of like a governed space, i.e. a portal, as a mechanism to sort of, as a forcing function to get you in that, towards that.
And I could speak to many organizations, one that I just spoke to today, that is setting up an analytical environment, and any data that is going to be ingested into the environment has to follow a certain set of standards to get done. So I'm completely with you on that. And then the other thing that I would add to the question, or to my answer, would be, in a large organization, don't try to do it all at once. Do it incrementally. Work in a specific area and get it working, and then it's almost as low. It's not even a slice of the pie. It's a slice of the pie. And then you start to incrementally start to expand that across the organization. And you're going to learn from what you're doing, and you're going to improve over time. Don't expect to flip a switch and have a large organization go from being ungoverned to governed in BI, in data, in BI data.
So Bob, this is an interesting question. Do you have any recommendations regarding team size to support this kind of functionality?
Team size. Yeah, that's a great question. It really, I hate to give a consulting answer, but the consulting answer is it depends, right? I can't tell you, you need 3 people, you need 10 people. I will tell you that you need somebody. One of the best practices that I use all the time in clients is that if there's not somebody who is accountable for facilitating and administering governance, it's going to be at risk immediately. So you got to have at least one person, or at least a percentage of one person's time, to make any progress at all. The problem is that in a lot of organizations, they set expectations for data governance, and they don't have nearly the capacity in resources to be able to do the things that they're saying that they're going to do when they're governing BI or governing data. So you got to be very aware of what you actually have capacity to do. So I'm not going to throw a number at you as to the appropriate number of people to be on the team. It's at least one, or at least part of that one, to get anything done at all. And the only way that you're going to get resources added to that team or to that office or whatever you call it is through demonstration that you have a plan, through having a way to see whether or not you're successful. And so the key word there is going to be capacity. Again, if you only have one person, recognize that your capacity is going to be less than if you had 3 people. If you have 3 people, you need to justify why you have 3 people, which is another issue and another thing that needs to be addressed. So there is no perfect science to that answer, but I would just make certain that you don't oversell what you can do until you have the capacity to do it.
Well, that's a great point, and I think it's also I would also add to that what Bob said. Taking in that incrementalist approach is absolutely right. You think about where you can show value first, and most visibly, and because I think you want to build. There's an evolution here, and as you show value in each stage, you can move to more higher levels of sophistication. The other thing to consider is it shouldn't just be all about FTEs dedicated to governance. Most of the governance is going to take place by people that already have other jobs. They're kind of doing it implicitly already. Think about it for a moment. People are publishing content today, right? These content publishers, there is governance there. They're self-governing. This is the thing I publish. What you're doing is you're introducing maybe a slightly different process that's going to have this happen in a more consistent way. And you want to do it in a way which does not require them double the time that they would take to do it before. Maybe it requires 5% more, a little bit more. Maybe it's the same amount of time, but just doing it a little differently. And they're introducing all this metadata into the process that's useful. So it's all about sort of designing a process, as to coin Bob's concept of non-invasive, a way that you can really mesh with what the organization is willing to do, where you can leverage all of the folks in the organization, their content publishers that are interested in governance, the business users that are working with that content, that have a vested interest in making sure that their community of people within their organization are consuming it accurately. You can engage them to say, well, maybe they should be the ones doing the tagging to the KPI. So yeah, I know this is
I know, you know what, I'm very glad that you're recording this session so I can go back and look to it, because you know what, you would be I'm not looking for salespeople, but you've got the non-invasive approach down. I mean, you really understand that people have day jobs that we don't want to add to what they're doing. If we're taking a non-invasive approach, it's like the old BASF commercials. We don't make the tires, we make them better. Like, we don't make the data, we make the data better. We make the process of managing the data better. So everything that you just described, it reeked of non-invasive data governance in the best possible way. And so, like I said, I'm going to go back. I want to see how you worded that, because I think that made a lot of sense.
Thanks, Bob. So here's another one. We've got a lot of questions. We're not okay. We're going to take 2 more, and then we'll follow up on any that we don't get.
And I got a meeting at the top of the hour, so we got to do this.
Okay, we'll do one more then. One more. What is the most successful way to get engagement from executives to support BI governance when an analytics team traditionally holds BI, quote unquote, and data teams own governance? How might we build collaboration rather than fight about ownership? So the question about ownership as it relates to, the BI, basically the executive supporting BI, analytics team traditionally holds BI, and then data teams owns governance.
Well, that's a really good question, and it should get a long answer. But focusing on the leadership part of that, there are questions that we can ask people who use the BI environment that will make the case for why this is important and why it's important to govern the environment. Those 2 questions are, what can't you do in the BI environment or in any part of the environment that you really would like to be able to do, or that you need to do because you don't trust or have the confidence in the data to do it? People open up about what they can't do, and you can tie that back to data governance. The second question is a lot like the first, but it's reversed. It's what could you do? Or what would you be able to do if you had all the data that you needed and you trusted that data and had confidence in the data? And if you can get your stakeholders to answer think outside the box and think about things that they would be able to do. There's really a third question that goes with those two. And the third question is, well, what the heck do those first two questions have to do with data governance? If you can relate it to where governing the BI environment, governing the data environment is going to help address those things that people can't do and help them to do the things that they would ideally like to be able to do, you're going to make a hell of a case to get support, sponsorship, and understanding from your leadership.
Okay, well, I think we'll have to leave it at that. I want to thank Bob for joining us today. I think it was a very lively conversation. Really appreciate his great insights. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this webinar, and look for a follow-up with the white paper that includes many of the great ideas that Bob shared with us today. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.